I'm Phil Cubitt. I'm here today with Brian Klontz, and we're talking about the topic in which he is the acknowledged expert, gifts of non-cash assets, and in particular, creative charitable planning with gifts of non-cash assets. Brian, thank you very much for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Let me ask you, why is this topic so important for our viewers?
When you're advising, your viewers are advising their clients or their donors, and you look at their balance sheets, most of them have the fewest portion of the overall balance sheet is in cash. But yet that's what every advisor and every fundraiser is asking for, implicitly or explicitly. So it costs the most for them to be able to make a cash contribution from a tax perspective. It hurts their lifestyle the most, and it's what they have the least of. So expanding the thinking with both fundraisers and professional advisors to think further across the balance sheet, to look at illiquid assets like real estate, closely held business interests, and other kind of collectibles is key in this market.
Thank you. And when we talk about non-cash assets, what does that term mean? What is in that bucket, non-cash assets?
It's anything that's illiquid. So if it's cash or publicly traded securities, that would not be deemed to be non-cash, anything that would be illiquid. And when you think of that relative to the entire stock market, the illiquid assets like real estate, closely held business interests, and collectibles are about 4 to 6 times that of the entire stock market. But yet when you look at the actual cash donations made each year, there's still about 95 to 96% of all donations made each year are in cash. It just makes no sense at all.
And what are some of the key, I know you work in this field and you see a lot of cases. What are the kinds of assets you are seeing?
The primary assets that we see in good times and bad times are real estate in various forms, whether they're owned outright, whether they're in a limited partnership or LLC, but the underlying asset is real estate in about 2/3 to 3/4 of the cases that we see. And in many cases, that's because they either purchased it a long time ago and have a low basis, or they've depreciated that property down over time, which reduces, of course, their adjusted tax basis. The real key point here is if you gave Coca-Cola stock with 0 basis, and let's say it was worth $100,000, you're going to get the full fair market value deduction for that gift with no capital gains tax. Real estate, closely held business interests can work exactly the same way.
Great. So closely held business interests would that be the second largest category you see?
It would be. It's about 20 to 25% of everything we see would be closely held businesses.
And I've heard you give this presentation and talk about what you call weird stuff. What goes into the weird stuff category?
All kinds of stuff. So if you're on the plane and I want to talk to you, which I usually don't, I would say I help rich people give weird things to charity, which of course they ask, what's the weirdest thing? But we've done a quarter horse before, a seat on the New York Mercantile Exchange, oil and gas interests, all kinds of paintings, literally dead animals, so taxidermy animals in the past, coins, international property. So lots of different assets that can be owned by your clients and donors that can be very conducive for their charitable gifts, to fulfill that passion out of gifts out of their illiquid pocket rather than funding those gifts out of cash or even publicly traded securities out of their liquid pocket.
Right. So if we're working with non-cash assets, we, using the techniques you're going to talk to us about, can convert those into very good gifts.
Yes.
And we can also convert them into assets under management. Would that be correct?
That's exactly right. And what I always say is it takes a non-working asset and it becomes a working asset. But that does require the advisor to look further across the balance sheet. In the 80s and the 90s, my joke is a chipmunk could have done charitable planning. And that is simply looking at the appreciated stock that's gone up the most and done a DTC wire transfer of that stock. But being able to look further across the balance sheet, perhaps in other assets that the advisor may or may not be comfortable with traditionally, looking at real estate holdings, looking at the closely held business interests that is currently not part of the overall perhaps financial plan or assets under management, but being able to inject those assets into the charitable sphere, have that liquidated, and in many cases continue to manage those assets. That's where advisors get pretty excited, and their clients are even more excited.
It really is one of those situations where it actually is win-win-win. That's used a lot, but this strikes me as one of those situations where everybody does end up ahead because of the expertise that's brought to bear.
You're exactly right.
Brian, could you give us like a 5-minute précis or summary of the key points we would need to know?
Sure. I think that the most important point, if you know nothing else after this video today is that cash bad, everything else good. So, and everything else is long-term capital gain property that's appreciated the most. The real key part is that's not only publicly traded stock, but as we've mentioned, that's real estate, closely held business interests, as well as other long-term capital gain property too. One important planning point is that if any of these illiquid asset gifts are made as donations to a private foundation during life, the deduction is the lesser of the fair market value or the adjusted cost basis. So you'll almost never see that happen. Most of these gifts are going to public foundations and public charities, in particular community foundation and community foundation-like entities that have donor-advised funds or other kinds of funds that they're able to take in those assets, receive a full fair market value deduction for the donor, being able to have that asset sold with no capital gains taxes, clearly out of the estate for estate tax purposes, and then they're in the public realm to be able to get the maximum tax advantages.
Excellent. Now, in order to do a deal like this, you've got to have a value for the asset. It's not publicly traded by definition.
Correct.
So how do we know what it's worth?
A qualified appraiser completing a qualified appraisal. Both of those are tightly defined in the code. But an appraiser can complete that appraisal as early as 60 days prior to the gift being made, up until the point that the donor actually files the tax return for the year of the gift. So let's say we're now in April, that appraisal could have been completed back in February of this year. Or if the client extends the tax return, the appraisal can be completed as late as October 15th of next year. So there's a very wide window to be able to have the appraisal complete, but it still must be performed by a qualified appraiser, and the appraisal itself must be qualified too. If there's any kind of inflation, what's called a gross or substantial misstatement as to value, after the Pension Protection Act, the appraiser can be personally penalized for a percentage of the inflated amount.
Right, there are two IRS forms, 8282 and 8283. Can you tell us a
Correct.
little about those?
Well, they are strangely simple forms, and I think even when people see them for the first time, they're surprised. So in 8283, if you were to have a client give a piece of real estate, the appraiser simply completes part 2 of a one-page form that simply describes the asset on the top of the form, assigns the value to it as of the date donated, and then in the middle of the form, the appraiser simply signs off as to that value. The bottom of the form is the donee section, where the charity actually signs off saying that they received it on that day. That's it. So that form is what's included in the 1040, and in some cases, the full appraisal itself must be included in the tax return too, but that's the substantiation requirement from the donor's perspective to actually value that property. Then the charity, once completing that form, has a 3-year window that if they sell or dispose of that property, they must complete what's known as the tattletale form, which is Form 8282, simply notifying the IRS on one page what it was sold for.
Okay, thank you. And that gives the IRS a chance to match them up and discover if the numbers really
It does.
make sense.
It does.
Okay.
One point that I would make on that, however, is many people think erroneously that if it sells for less than what that appraised value is, there's some kind of tax recapture. And that actually is not the case so long as the appraiser did a correct appraisal and the valuation was accurate as of the date of the gift.
I understand. So we have a situation where we have huge pools of these non-cash assets.
Mm-hmm.
We have vehicles that can accept them. We have the appraisal process. Are most of these gifts accepted and go smoothly? I mean, is this?
I wish. No. So the advisor can have the conversation to say, we've identified some assets that might be particularly optimal for you to be able to use to fund your charitable passions. Perhaps the fundraiser, a sophisticated fundraiser, even brought it up. And unfortunately, about 80% roughly of these assets that are initially offered to charities are declined. And there's several reasons why. So one of the key reasons why these gifts are at least initially declined are because of the tax and legal complexity. It's so easy to transfer a DTC stock over to charity, nothing to really worry about. But when you're dealing with real estate, as an example, you've got the issues relative to a prearranged sale, which could be the case, self-dealing, private inurement, a whole plethora of issues that can come up relative to that illiquid asset transaction that otherwise would not be apparent or evident with a gift of cash or publicly traded security. So the tax and legal complexity is probably one of the most difficult or challenging issues that charities have to overcome. The second thing, in particular with real estate, is every charity thinks that they get a piece of real estate, that every gas tank that's ever been buried in the country is on their property and will burst the moment they get it. So the environmental concerns is really the second one. I suggest that's a boogeyman that really does not exist that much, because the charity very easily can have an environmental appraiser go out and do what's called a phase 1 environmental on the property. And I'd also suggest, frankly, that the charities can use some common sense, where if there are lots of blue tanks everywhere and things are dripping out of those tanks and there are dead animals everywhere, they don't have to actually do a phase 1 environmental. They can eyeball it and figure out that may not be the best asset to take. So environmental issues, and at least vetting those appropriately, are another stumbling block that charities face. The third one really are the management issues. And by that I mean, if it is, let's also say real estate and it's an apartment complex, who's managing that apartment complex? Who's managing the property manager? Who's making sure the insurance is appropriately bound and with appropriate limits? These are the management responsibilities that the donors would have prior to making the gift, that when the charity owns these assets, now they become their management responsibilities. And too often that comes up under what I call the other duties as assigned in the business office that they don't like so much. So really having the business office engaged at the very early part of the discussion so that they understand what those issues may be, how comfortable they are with dealing with that, and then where they might need to get some outside help is also a critical point.
You know, where there are problems, sometimes there are no solutions. It's a hopeless mess. It's not even worth talking about.
Right?
Other times there's problems and solutions, and that's a business model.
Correct.
Am I correct in saying this is really your business model to solve this kind of a challenge? You have an organization that does it, and you're teaching others how to deal with these so we get a much higher closing ratio than 20% or 10%.
It is, and we've helped with over hundreds, actually now about $250 million worth of assets that otherwise were declined initially that were now captured. We do this, there are certainly a number of others that do as well, but in this wonderful world of specialization, if you need some help out there for these kinds of assets, it exists. It can lubricate that internal process and can help charities capture more of these gifts. And I will tell you, of the other issues that I mentioned before in terms of the challenges, the real issue is the charity's internal process in terms of how long it takes for them to vet these particular kinds of assets. In many cases, they will have actually a gift acceptance committee, and that committee, they might be able to get a quorum, if they're lucky, of 4 to 6 people in maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks. They then come back with questions to the donor. They might have to get the committee back together after 2 to 3 weeks to have another quorum. You're talking about a month to a month and a half to be able to come back to a donor who's trying to make a gift of an illiquid asset. A real key point, Phil, is that most of these gifts that I work on are partial interest gifts. And that simply means as an undivided interest in an asset like real estate or a closely held business. So these are gifts to say, I love you about 10% of my farm, not the whole thing. So in many cases, these gifts are at least verbally negotiated to where there might be a likely sale or buyer in the wings. They then contact the charity to say, is this something that you might like to take as a gift? If the charity takes a month and a half to get back to them to be able to say, yes, we can take it, that's usually about 5 weeks too long. So most of these gifts are not because of the sophistication or risk. Most of these gifts are at least initially declined or lost because of the internal process that the charity takes to actually vet them appropriately.
I understand it. And we're working with people who are in the business of getting to yes.
Yes.
I mean, these are advisors who want to get to yes.
That's right.
And they're working with a charity perhaps, or just working with their client. What I get from having followed your work and studied what seems to be happening is that it is possible to get to yes, but you have to get the right people involved.
That's true.
And there are various places they could turn, and check me if I'm correct. They could turn to your organization, because that's really your business, Charitable Solutions. They could turn to one of the national community foundations like Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard, are they getting into this game?
They are. They
Yeah,
are.
probably
Absolutely.
in a big way, because this is a sophisticated financial business, and they're sophisticated financial people.
Yes.
And you're training them how to do it. So,
That's correct.
So there's that outlet, and there's also your local community foundation, which should be able to do this, right? But are they? Is that the roster of the people? I mean, is that what our audience needs to know about getting these things done? To get the right players involved and call down that kind of a list?
It does. It is. And I think that is exactly the right pecking order in terms of sophistication. I would also suggest not only their local community foundation, but other community foundation type entities like religious foundations have a lot of capacity in this area as well. But usually what we recommend is call that charity that the donor wishes to make the gift first. And that charity hopefully will be a partner in that process to be able to hopefully quickly respond about their capacity and comfort to be able to complete the gift, and or find a partner, many of which that you've already mentioned, to be able to help them make that gift happen, to have a happy client, a happy advisor, and most importantly, having that gift have the most impact possible for their organization.
Mm-hmm. And there are other ones, as you're saying, I'm thinking about all the other ones that I know who are also looking for this, like NPT, National Philanthropic Trust,
Right.
American Endowment Foundation. What are some of the others that you would associate with this?
Those are really the big ones. So the larger national donor advised funds, most every one of them either have internal capacity or they have outsourced capacity to be able to provide that sort of service for their clients.
Right.
And then certainly the larger charities, the large universities, Ivy League universities, things like that. Where some of this becomes a little bit more turbulent is where you have a client that doesn't necessarily want to give everything to one charity. If that's the case, it's usually fairly simple to do if you're working with a large, sophisticated charity. But most clients want to give to 3, 4, 5 different charities, or perhaps anonymously, or perhaps over time. So in many cases, many that you mentioned, the donor advised fund sponsors in particular do a lot of work in this space because they're able to take the one illiquid asset transaction, do the one tax acknowledgement letter, have that sold, and then they're able to, at the donor's request and recommendation, make those grants over time to the various charities that the donor really wants to be able to support.
Right. Before we move on, let me ask you this. This is my impression. I think there's obviously a huge market here, as you outlined, and there are significant stumbling blocks to accessing that money, all the legal complexity and all things you mentioned. And there's now a body of knowledge out there about how to do it, and you're helping to install that body of knowledge in many organizations. Would you predict that percentage of gifts is going to escalate, that there's going to become a dogleg up based on the kind of work you're doing? We're going to see a significant increase in gifts of non-cash assets.
I hope so, because it's my life's work, and to think that it would make me feel pretty
But
depressed.
don't you see that? I mean, in the data I
We
see
do.
from like Fidelity, for example, it's the fastest growing part of their business, as far as I can see.
We do. And I think there are a couple things that are very important to understand about that trend. The first thing is that if you have donor conversations or client conversations, and you ask them what liquidity meant to them in 2006 and 7, I would suggest that the definition of liquidity today is very different. They realize what a cash position, and they realize too what marketable securities mean as it relates to liquidity. So more and more of these clients that see need are asking their advisors to maintain their liquidity as best as they can, but to look at those other assets which could be very useful for their charitable giving, but making sure that they're still going to be okay in any eventuality. So clients, to a great extent, donors, are driving that discussion. The second piece is, when you look at all of the illiquid assets donated each year, it ranges between about 3 and 5% or so. On a percentage basis, that's quite low, in fact, too low. But on a nominal basis, you're still talking about $15 billion a year that are donated in these illiquid assets. This is not thrift store stuff. These would be required qualified appraiser completing a qualified appraisal, larger assets. So to think that the market, given the scale of the entire marketplace of illiquid assets, at the same time you have now clients wanting to maintain their liquidity, at the same time now I hope charities are more comfortable in having that conversation. And I encourage all of them, shake those bushes more than you've ever shaken them before, and weird stuff may fall out. You don't have the luxury like the 80s and the 90s to discard these kind of assets. You really have to engage with that donor, engage with the donor's advisors to determine what is the best asset to give, and then how can we help facilitate that transaction. So I certainly hope in this marketplace that maybe 8 to 10, 8 to 12% of all assets really should be coming in this form. If the charities were more open about the conversation, and if advisors were not as lazy as they used to be, just looking at cash or marketable securities and looking further across that balance sheet to identify opportunities.
It sounds to me like what we're saying is that the market is huge. It has not been very well penetrated because it's complex. But there's now a number of people out there who are getting really good at this, and there's a lot of money to be moved through these vehicles, and that if our advisors don't get involved soon, they may kind of miss the boat.
I would completely agree.
Yeah. What are some of the? I think you have a list, the top 10 questions you get about non-cash assets. Could you give us those?
Sure. Well, I think there are a couple key ones, and this is really part of the due diligence or the vetting, either on the for-profit advisor side or as the not-for-profit fundraising side. The first big one really is who or what owns the asset. And I think we've all experienced that whenever you ask that question, they always say that they own the asset, and then you look at the actual deed and their name is nowhere on it. It's in trust or owned by a corporation. So really understanding the ownership of the asset is key. And then also what the potential value may be. And whenever I ask, what would you estimate the value, I always ask the follow-up question, and how did you arrive at that value? And if they say we have a qualified appraisal, that's one thing, versus my cousin Bubba said it's worth, it might be perhaps another. So really understanding what that value may be. It's important on that point too, that many people ask me, what value is the minimum really to be able to do some of these gifts? And I would say, probably generally speaking, that $50,000 to $100,000 tends to be the minimum required to jump through these hoops and to go through the machinations to be able to make these gifts occur. For our firm, we really don't do much less than about $150,000. But I would also suggest in the last 12 years, our average has been about $3.4 million. So these tend to be very large transactions, especially when donated to multiple places. But understanding what that value is also key. Also understanding what the management issues are, as I'd mentioned before. So many donors strangely think that as soon as the charity receives any kind of asset that we're able to poof it into cash immediately, and that really doesn't take place. So if we understand what the management and holding period issues may be, then that's something that we can be at least more eyes wide open as we enter into the discussion whether or not we're able to connect and take that asset or not.
About debt?
Yeah. So debt is always an issue. So there are ways to handle property with debt. They're just not fun to do. I would say of the roughly 600 of these transactions that I've been involved with in my career, I think 5 have had debt. So when you start getting loan to values over 30% or more, it usually does not make sense to be able to use that as the donated asset. It creates a bargain sale issue, can trigger capital gains immediately back to the donor that I assure you they do not expect or anticipate. And it's all phantom, which makes it even more tricky. But there are times when there is debt that meets certain exceptions that are less than 25, 30% or so loan to value, where it actually can still work in some scenarios.
Okay. And what about partial versus entire interest?
Yeah, that's a real key point. And as I mentioned, of the roughly 600 of these that we've worked on, about 75% of those have been partial interests. So those are interest in a property that is an undivided interest that is received by the charity but does not represent the entire interest in the property. So most donors say if we have an apartment complex that we've verbally negotiated a sales price for, we might give 5 or 10% of that to the charity prior to actually moving forward with a binding sale agreement. That is textbook, where that advisor will sit them down and they will say, if you've ever wanted to be charitable, if you think your kids will ever want to be charitable, before you get ready to sell this long-term capital gain asset, before it goes under a legally binding contract, now is the time for pre-sale tax planning to make a specific percentage interest gift over to a specific charity, get the full fair market value deduction for that, and then to be able to use those proceeds to fund your charitable gifts.
And would you want to ask the advisor about where they are in the sales process and
Yes.
how close they are to the done deal?
Yes, and the general rule there is verbally you can discuss most everything, but the second you have lots of dates and lots of signatures on a purchase and sale agreement, it might be too late. So you want to be very, very careful and have very good legal counsel about whether or not it actually is a prearranged sale or not. I would say probably a quarter of the calls that I get are too late in the process. They wait too long, and they always start the conversation like, oh, it'll be so easy for the charity. You just have to show up next Wednesday at the closing table and just pick up your check.
Exactly.
It's too late. So an assignment of income, all that capital gain that the donor thought he or she was getting out of will all come back on them.
Right. So these are qualifying questions the
They
advisor
are.
should get on top of before they call you, just to see whether they actually have a prospect.
That's correct. And some things too, Phil, as it relates to that, really gets back to the minimum. There are just certain assets that are just not very conducive for this. So while I've talked a lot about the very broad range of illiquid assets, there are some that are just not good. So timeshares are horrible. I would not ever deal with a timeshare ever. There's no timeshare that's ever appreciated in value since the beginning of time. So this is not a long-term gain issue or tax issue. This usually is a dumping of the timeshare to a charity because the donor can't sell it him or herself, and they don't want to pay the annual maintenance fees. So usually timeshares, usually most always, are not very good assets to give. My joke is anything that eats. So if there's an animal in some form that's eating something somewhere, that probably is also not a good asset to give, generally speaking. There are actually some agricultural departments at universities that have received entire herds of things that may disagree with me. So there's some situations where that can work. And the third thing is anything with a steering wheel. So usually cars, boats, planes also have not appreciated in value. And unless they're being given to a charity that can put that to a related use, perhaps a car to a social service agency whose members or clients are able to use the car for job search or for their own use. In some cases that can work, but usually anything with the steering wheel is not worth the effort to go through as well. And the final thing is cemetery plots. Don't ever, 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 ever give a cemetery plot or receive one. They will never be sold. And in many cases, the charities cannot use them for indigent care, which is what most advisors think, unfortunately. So they'll give them to a religious institution or perhaps to a hospital. But because it costs so much money to open the grave and then to close the plot, most charities are never able to get those off their books.
You're going to give us some case studies of deals that have closed, and I look forward to hearing those. It feels to me like the goal of CAMP is to bring advisors and fundraisers together in common purpose when they need to work together.
Yes.
And it feels to me like this is a prime case in point where the charity's not going to get this done without advisor involvement many times, and vice versa. Would you agree with that?
Completely,
Yeah.
completely. And I would also say most charities are not raising the illiquid asset question when they're making proposals or they're making asks for specific projects or purposes. In most cases that I'm involved with, the advisor is the one. Very sophisticated advisors are bringing this up to their clients and then taking that back to the charities directly, so that you already have a team approach with that specific gift, but more often than not, you're having to bring in at least one more party to be able to help with the facilitation of that gift, the tax or legal planning of the gift, or the actual sale of the gift too.
I guess one of my dreams is there are community foundations and nonprofits who are listening to this, and they've got some advisors they've invited to hear it, and some lights are going on, and some real deals are going to happen as a result.
Yes, and they do, and they have, and it's amazing to watch. And I love, to a point, to hear an advisor say, I wish I would have known this 3 months ago. I wish I would have known this a year ago. We had the perfect situation with a client, and if I would have known this was a possibility, instead we ended up funding charitable gifts, which is great, but with the proceeds from the sale, which is not the best way to do that. So hopefully this can incite and inspire more of those conversations to happen earlier on in the planning process, which then simply means bigger gifts happen and more gifts happen.
Well, thank you very much. Let's talk about your case studies to see
Sure.
how it actually works.
Sure.